I have full confidence in Catherine and William. Their judgment is sound, their loyalty unquestioned.
Behind a heavy oak door in a private wing of the palace, a story begins that has never been confirmed by any official source, because it never happened, at least not in the world we know. But imagine for a moment a version of history where a king faces the hardest decision of his reign, alone, with only a pen and a folder between him, and a truth he isn't ready to speak aloud. This is that story. Before we go further, a quick note. Everything you're about to hear is a work of fiction. The names may echo a real royal family, but the events, dialogue, and decisions described here are entirely invented for dramatic and entertainment purposes. Now, let's begin. In this telling, the king has ruled for several years, carrying the weight of an institution far older than himself. He is a man shaped by decades of waiting to inherit, waiting to matter, waiting for the moment when duty would finally be entirely his own. Now that the crown rests on his head, he understands something his own mother never fully explained to him, that a monarchy is never truly stable in the present. It is only ever as stable as its plan for tomorrow. On this particular evening, senior advisors are called into a private chamber. Phones are collected at the door, a formality reserved for matters considered too sensitive for casual recording. The king enters carrying a folder. Nothing about his expression gives away what's inside, but the room senses immediately that this is not an ordinary meeting. Inside the folder is a document we'll call the continuity framework, a fictional construct for this story, representing an expanded plan for preparing the heir for eventual duties, including access to certain briefings and responsibilities previously reserved only for the sovereign. It is not an abdication. It is not a transfer of the crown. It is, in this imagined version of events, an acknowledgement that the machinery of monarchy must never depend on the assumption that its leader will always be available. The king signs the document. He does not celebrate. He does not explain himself to the room. He simply closes the folder and asks that his son be summoned to Windsor. Now we shift to the prince. Call him the heir, a man who has spent his adult life in a strange kind of limbo, publicly certain of his future and privately uncertain of when or how that future would actually begin. He receives a message asking him to return home immediately. No explanation, just an instruction. His wife notices the shift in his expression before he says a word. Something has happened, he tells her, folding the note and stepping out into a car that will carry him toward a conversation he doesn't yet know he's about to have. This is the heart of the story. Not a constitutional crisis, but a family one. Every monarchy, real or imagined, eventually asks a father and a son to sit across from each other and discuss the day one of them will no longer be there. It's a conversation few families ever have honestly, and royal families, bound by protocol and performance, often have it even less. When the prince arrives, he finds his father standing by a fireplace, not seated behind a desk. It's a small detail, but a telling one. Desks are for briefings, fireplaces are for confessions. The king gestures to a chair. The prince remains standing. He can tell, instinctively, that whatever is coming is not a routine update. The king explains, as best he can, that he has authorized a framework meant to ensure the monarchy can function smoothly no matter what happens to him personally. He insists it isn't a prediction of tragedy, only protection. But his voice catches on that last word, and the prince hears the hesitation more clearly than the explanation itself. The prince opens the folder he's handed. It contains only partial information, the outline of a plan, not its full architecture. Several sections remain sealed. When he asks why, his father tells him only that some truths are better absorbed gradually. It's an answer that satisfies no one, least of all the son sitting across from him. Later, alone, the prince finally opens up to his wife. He tells her, quietly, that he isn't afraid of one day becoming king. He's afraid of everything that has to happen before that. The loss, the absence, the silence where his father used to be. It's the kind of fear that has nothing to do with duty and everything to do with love. Meanwhile, we learn, in this fictional telling, what actually triggered the king's decision. It wasn't ambition or image management. It was a moment of genuine institutional failure. During a major public ceremony, An urgent message required the sovereign's immediate attention, but the king was, for a short window, unreachable. Advisors argued outside a side chamber over what, if anything, could be shown to the heir in the meantime. The answer ultimately was nothing. The prince, a man trusted to represent the nation before crowds of thousands, was, in that moment, not trusted with a folder. The delay lasted only a matter of minutes, but it was long enough to terrify the king. He returned, dismissed the room, and apologized to his son directly. A rare and uncomfortable admission for a man raised never to apologize publicly for institutional failure. That night, he ordered his advisors to draft something stronger, a formal mechanism to ensure this gap could never happen again. The first draft, cautious and heavily qualified, wasn't enough for him. He wanted something with teeth, something that would actually work under pressure, not just look reassuring on paper. That determination is what eventually became the document signed at the story's opening. When the prince eventually learns this history, his first reaction isn't gratitude. It's frustration. In a private, unwitnessed conversation with his father, he demands to know why all of this happened without him. He isn't angry about the plan itself. He's angry that his own future was reshaped in a room he wasn't allowed into. The king, for his part, believed secrecy was protective. He worried that any public discussion of contingency planning would be misread as a sign of failing health or an impending abdication, rumors that could destabilize the very continuity he was trying to secure. But the prince hears something else in that explanation, that his father made the most consequential decision of his future without him in the room. Their conversation, in this fictional account, becomes less about constitutional mechanics and more about the unspoken grief buried inside succession itself. The prince finally asks the question that's been sitting beneath everything. Did his father sign this because the institution needed it, or because some part of him feared he might not be there to lead it much longer? The king's answer isn't immediate. When it comes, it isn't really about policy at all. He admits that the ceremony failure frightened him more than he let on. That for those few unreachable minutes, he pictured exactly the scenario the monarchy is built to prevent: an unavailable sovereign and an heir capable but powerless to act. He couldn't unsee that image, and he wasn't willing to leave his son exposed to it again. This is where the story finds its emotional center. The prince realizes his father's secrecy wasn't about control. It was about fear, expressed the only way a man raised inside centuries of royal discipline knows how to express it. And the king realizes that his silence, meant to protect his son from worry, instead made his son feel shut out of his own future. In one of the story's quieter scenes, father and son take a walk together with no advisors, no folders, no titles, just two men talking. The prince asks his father what it felt like when his own mother first began preparing him for the throne. The king admits something he's never said aloud, that every lesson felt tangled up with guilt because preparing for the role meant, on some level, imagining a future where she was gone. It's the kind of confession that has nothing to do with statecraft and everything to do with love, mortality, and the strange cruelty of succession. That stepping into the role you were born for requires losing the person who prepared you for it. The prince tells his father, in that same walk, that every new responsibility handed to him now feels tied to the possibility of losing him. He isn't rejecting the plan. He's grieving in advance, the way people sometimes do when they can see a loss coming long before it arrives. The king places a hand on his son's shoulder. He explains that the document was never written because he expects to disappear soon. It was written because history doesn't wait politely for convenient timing, and he refuses to leave his son unprepared if it doesn't. By the end of their conversation, the prince accepts the expanded responsibilities, but on his own terms. He asks that everything be framed publicly as support for his father's ongoing reign, not as a quiet changing of the guard. He doesn't want the country to read continuity planning as an ending. His father agrees. For a brief moment, in this fictional version of events, father and son are no longer on opposite sides of a folder. They're carrying the same weight together. Of course, no secret stays contained forever, not even a fictional one. A summary of the plan leaks before either man can control how it's presented. Overnight, the invented nation in our story wakes up to fragmented headlines, speculation, and a debate over what preparing the heir really means. Some see it as responsible planning. Others assume the worst, that an abdication, or worse, is quietly being arranged behind palace walls. A palace statement, careful and measured, tries to clarify that the sovereign remains fully in his role, and that succession planning is a normal, unremarkable duty of any monarchy. But careful language rarely satisfies a public already primed for drama. Some outlets frame it responsibly, others don't. The turning point in our story comes not through another statement, but through a public appearance. Father and son walk into a national ceremony together, not with the heir trailing several steps behind, as tradition might dictate, but beside him. It's a small positional choice, but it carries enormous symbolic weight. The king hasn't stepped aside. He's simply stopped hiding the fact that he's preparing his successor in the open, rather than in secrecy. Before they step forward, the king adjusts his son's ceremonial insignia and tells him quietly, "You're ready to learn what no one can learn alone." The prince meets his father's eyes and answers, "Then we'll do it together." It's a small invented moment, but it captures the emotional truth this fictional story is really about. That succession in any monarchy isn't just a legal or constitutional process. It's a deeply human one, built on trust, fear, love, and the impossible task of preparing for a loss you're not ready to name. By the story's end, nothing about the actual chain of power has changed. The king remains fully sovereign. The prince has simply been let further into a process he was always going to inherit eventually, this time with honesty instead of secrecy standing between them. And that ultimately is the quiet argument at the center of this fictional tale. That institutions survive not by hiding change, but by facing it honestly, together, before it's forced upon them by circumstance instead of choice.